The journey is conversations with ordinary people about stories of transformation and how we may have had setbacks in our life and how we persevered through those, how we've learned from those obstacles, and how they've maybe helped us on our path today. So, Ralph Velasco, thanks for joining us today on The Journey. And let me just mention a little bit about what The Journey is. The Journey is an opportunity to have just a conversation with individuals who have, throughout their life, maybe either have had obstacles in their life or maybe that they have transformed their lives, recreated themselves through whatever means that was. Maybe it was business, maybe it was some kind of setbacks in relationships or setback financially or mental health wise, addiction or whatever that may be. So welcome. And so if you could maybe just mention a little bit about not only who you are, but if and when you have opportunity for fun, what does Ralph do for fun?
Well, that's a great question because as an entrepreneur, as you know, there's always something to do, and so I'm kind of a one-man show. I've got a very part-time assistant that works with me and helps me with some things in my business, but when you work, especially out of your home or wherever your laptop is, which is what I do, there's always seems to be something to do. So fun, but for fun, what I tend to do, I love to read. I love to learn. I'm a constant learner, so I'm always watching I've really gotten hooked on YouTube videos for anything at all that I want to learn. Okay. Whether it's changing out an outlet to learning how to set up a YouTube channel or whatever it might be. So I love to read. I love music. I love movies and documentaries, things like that. So with my job, which I organize and lead tours around the world, I am constantly on the go. And so when I'm home, which home is really, like I said, where my laptop is, but I really don't have a home. I'm what's come to be called location independent, which is a nice way of saying homeless, but in a good way. But so when I'm in the U.S., typically I'll stay with family here in Rockford, and so to me, kind of what I do is just relax. I try to relax and just kind of take advantage of that downtime because typically I'm always on the go, either on planes, trains, automobiles, with a group, touring, doing that kind of thing. So I really appreciate my downtime.
Okay. You said vocation independent. That's a new term. I'm not familiar with that. What does that mean?
Actually, it's location independent.
Oh, location independent.
Location independent. Okay. It's just kind of a new term that means you're independent of location, I guess. Means you don't really have a permanent home. Oh, okay. Good. So there's a lot of people that are doing this, digital nomads, which are traveling around the world and just doing business wherever their laptop is, which is really interesting because of this internet society that we have now, and the fact that we could run businesses from anywhere in the world, that there's an internet connection.
Well, absolutely, and it's such a different than the traditional or historical brick and mortar, or even before brick and mortar, it was tied to the land, right? So all of industry, historically has been about a location. It has been about either originally a piece of land, or if there were hunter-gatherers, that aspect of it, and then later it became more manufacturing, and then that again goes back to buildings and brick and mortar, and now because of technology, that has, in some aspects, has changed, or at least for some individuals, have allowed them to be not tied to a piece of property or not tied to that brick and mortar. So, well, tell us a little bit about your background first. And so, I know for sure you have one sister, and because I've known her, and she's also a therapist, and I've known Vicki for a long time. And so it was just the two of you, and grew up in Park Ridge,
right?
And what did mom and dad do?
Yeah, so I grew up in Park Ridge, which is a suburb of Chicago, and my parents were the first franchisees of Brown's Chicken. It's got to be over 55 years ago now. Quick, interesting story about that. Brown's at the time had 7 stores. It was started by John Brown and Frank Portillo, whose brother, Dick Portillo, started Portillo's Hot Dogs. Okay. My grandparents were friends with their parents for many, many years, and so my dad wanted to get into the restaurant business way back when, in probably the early 60s, and so knew that that Frank had this group of restaurants, and he might be interested. So he said, well, how could we do this? How could we set this up? And so my dad said, well, there's this new restaurant chain called McDonald's, and they're doing this thing called franchising. Why don't we look into that? And so, sure enough, they became the first franchisees of Brown's Chicken, store number 8, I think in 1963, actually, the year I was born. Okay. Fast forward, I went to Loyola Academy in Wilmette. I went to Indiana University, studied small business and entrepreneurship, came out and ended up purchasing a small restaurant in Park Ridge that I used to go to when I was a kid. So now I'm 21 at this point. So I bought this restaurant. It was a Chicago hot dog stand, and loved it. It was fun, but I sold it after a couple of years. I did a round the world trip. I said, before I do anything else, I'm going to do a round the world trip, which at the time, 1988, was not as easy as it is today. Sure. Theoretically, before the internet, before cell phones, virtually before the wheel. So did that, and then I did a lot of other things, real estate, and I was the marketing director for a division of Fortune 500 company. I was then I had my second restaurant, which was 2001 to 4, and I said I was coming up to my end of my 3-year lease, my initial 3-year lease, and it was a matter of deciding, was I going to sign for another 5 years or do something different? Okay. And so I was, the restaurant was doing okay. It was kind of barely breaking even. It was tough because I opened up like 3-4 months right before 9/11 in downtown Chicago. And so, people were, at that time, were pretty skittish about being in the city. Mm-hmm. And I was just a few blocks away from the Sears Tower, was it next kind of thing.
I remember that.
So I started, what saved me was I added catering to my business, and so that ended up being about 50% of my business, which was fantastic. So that saved me. So anyway, make a long story longer, I decided to sell the restaurant. I found someone to purchase it, and what I did as I was deciding was I took a yellow pad, and on the left-hand side I wrote down the things that I thought were negative about the restaurant business. Speaking of, having to have land or brick and mortar, I had to have an actual restaurant that costs like $5,000 a month. That rent came due the first of the month every month, whether business was good or bad. Yeah. So that was a big nut to crack. So I didn't want that. I had employees. I was selling something that people put in their mouths and could potentially get sick on. I had a lot of money tied up in inventory. I came home smelling like a French fry every night. All these things. And so on the right-hand side of the paper, I wrote the opposite of those. I said, I want to work wherever my laptop is. I don't want employees. I want to work for myself. I want to sell a service or a virtual product as opposed to food. and I want to take a shower before work, not after. So, and now this was at the dawn of digital photography, so the early 2000s, and so digital cameras were just kind of coming to be, and I saw a potential. Now, I've always been a traveler, so since high school, when I went to Loyola, and I was 15 years old when I studied in Spain one summer, and I was absolutely hooked on international travel. Next year, I was a volunteer in Peru. Next year, I volunteered in Venezuela. The following summer, I studied in Mexico City. So the reason I go back to that is, I always thought that making a living from travel was like becoming a rock star, or an actor. I mean, it's virtually impossible, and hardly anyone makes it to that level, or because it was such a dream job. So I did all these other things, and so with digital photography, I always loved photography as well, and was I guess fairly good at it. People told me that they enjoyed my images, so I saw this opportunity, but it wasn't. I didn't see the opportunity in selling images, which, like stock photography. I saw it as selling the picks and shovels to the miners. So selling the people were going to want to learn how to use these new digital devices, these cameras and things. So I saw it in teaching people that, and I love to teach. Hadn't really done it much at that point, but I always loved teaching and learning. And so I saw an opportunity in setting up walking tours that had to do with photography.
Let me go back, and I want to ask you something, because I think I'd like to go back and do that first time. I think somewhere when you were 15 and you went over to Spain, and you said that hooked you. And so tell us a little bit about that piece of it, and then we're gonna because I wonder how much that plays a part into also part of your teaching process. So what was it like? I mean, what was it about being in Spain, 15 years old? What was it that hooked you? What do you say hooked you?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd done some travel with my family. We used to go to Mexico about every other year, every third year, when I was even younger than that. So I had a little bit of international experience, but that was always with the family. This was on my own with my high school. So, of course, we had, at the time, priests, because I went to an all-boys Catholic high school, a couple teachers, things like that. But we were learning Spanish. It was a 6-week program. Here I am, 15 years old, on my own on this other continent, spoke a little bit of Spanish, but was learning. And there was, we could have drinks at that time. There was no drinking age or anything. So, that was kind of fun. But it was more about just being in this new world where everyone spoke Spanish. Everything was written in a different language. There was different money. The time zones was different. It was funny. I used to write letters to my mother, my family, on the toilet paper, because it was like, what do you call it? Not cardboard, but it was so solid that you could actually write on it. It's not like it didn't disintegrate when you took a pen to it. And it was just being funny. I was just trying to be funny. So I just fell in love with that whole idea of seeing incredible things, bullfights, different kinds of food, meeting all these new people, and I was just hooked, especially on Europe, because it was similar. Somewhat it was Western culture, so I could drink the water. It was safe and all these things, but it was still so different.
Sure. And there because you told me many times about your trips, and because it's so much more than the photography piece, and it seems like that. Well, and a lot of times when people are going to be traveling, they're traveling and they're seeing things for the very first time that you're bringing them on. So it's about this experience that they're having, and they're also being shown how to use this camera, how to be able to capture images that they're not going to see maybe in their hometown. So.
Yeah, there's nothing I love more than I love to scout a place before I bring a group back. So typically I'll go to a place a year in advance because I want to be there at the same time of year that I'm going to bring the group back, because for photography there might be the seasons or festivals or things like that, weather. So I love to scout, and what I do on those scouting trips, I probably do 2 to 3 times the amount of activities and experiences, but I meet all the guides and try the hotels and restaurants, etc., transportation. And so then there's nothing I love more than to bring a group back and to have them experience the best of what I did during that scouting trip, because we couldn't possibly do the amount of things that I did on my own with my local guide or tour operator that I'm working with when I'm with 10 or 12 people, which my groups are typically anywhere from 10 to 14 people at most. So they're small groups. So nothing I love more than to introduce them to some interesting person that I met, to take them to this fantastic wine tasting, vineyard that I went to, or try the bamboo train in Cambodia, or do a tuk-tuk adventure or something, and then to see it and relive it through their eyes, and to help them capture images that capture that feeling as much as possible for their friends and family. And one of the things that I often hear is that, Ralph, my images aren't capturing what I'm seeing here. And I thought about it a lot, and it comes down to the fact that it's just a 2-dimensional piece of paper. And when we're there, there's the smells and the sounds and the feelings and the temperature and all these different senses that make up that whole experience that a 2-dimensional piece of paper is not going to ever capture. I definitely can see how that would be, because I've done the same thing, only because I have a memory associated with that image. Does it bring up some of those same feelings, or that same type of experience? But if I'm just looking at someone else's pictures, and if it's just the picture, I don't even get the story that goes along with it. It's just not the same. Exactly.
It's not as it's not as powerful. So let's go. So I wanted to capture, hear a little bit about that piece, because that's really kind of the foundation of that. And then when you did your worldwide trip in '88, you were in your 20s, I'm assuming then, right. And so what was that like? So that was your first trip by yourself, but you went around the world.
Yeah, I literally went around the world. This was 1988. I was 24 years old. It ended up being a 5-month trip. And like I said, it was before the internet, before cell phones. So, doing the research was, calling travel agents or even tourist boards and asking them to send me physical brochures, because there wasn't an online brochure with a website to go to. So when I think about it, it's kind of funny now, although it's doesn't mean it's necessarily that much easier to do it today, but because there are just so many more choices. Right. But still, the research is a fun part of travel, I think. But that was amazing. So back then I bought a round the world ticket for $2,400. I remember exactly how much it was. If you were to look up a round the world ticket today, now this is over 30 years ago, it would still be about $2,400, which is hard to believe that in 30 years, that big part of travel has stayed about the same. But I think I went to 5 different continents, 15 countries. My girlfriend at the time met me in Europe for about a month, so that was fun. But I was ready to get home after that long. And, being 24 years old and moving around every 2, 3, 4 nights got tiring for 5 months. Sure. And it's kind of what I do today to a degree, although I try to be in one place for a period of time. But if I'm in one place for a week, that's a long time. And that's the difficult part of what I do. And no one's ever going to feel sorry for me. But After doing this now for 11 years plus full time, it's tiring.
Sure.
And packing and unpacking and planes, trains, automobiles, and it's very, very tiring. So I'm actually, my main company is Photo Enrichment Adventures, and that's these cultural tours that are based on photography. So photography is a part of the trip. They're not photo tours. They're certainly not photo workshops. So, but I've created a new brand called Alla Compagnia Experiences that is less about photography and more about being in one place for a period of time, maybe 4 or 5 nights, even up to 7 nights, and getting to know it really well instead of a region or a whole country over 14 days and moving around a lot.
Okay. So going back to the photo enrichment experience, obviously over the last 11 years it has changed, and there's different things that you've done and different experiences. What was that, if you remember back to the very first trip and 11 years ago when you had that, when you planned that trip and those first group of individuals went on with you, what was that like? 'Cause there had to have been fear and exciting at the same time.
Yeah, it was very different because today my trips, I organize them entirely on my own in conjunction with a local tour operator in the destination. Back then, the first trip I ever ran was in conjunction with a very big tour company. So my group of 6 people was a part of a much larger group. And the first trip I did was to the Central European Christmas markets. It was fantastic places: Prague, Munich, Salzburg, all these incredible, Budapest, wonderful locations. But we were at the mercy of the tour company because we were a part of their trip. Now, that was fine because the trip was very inexpensive, and there's always pluses and minuses to everything. But I learned early on that I want to be in control of when we leave, because they weren't concerned about photography and being able to get out early for the best light and getting into smaller little places and local restaurants and having these very intimate experiences, which is what I wanted with my group. There was 40 other people, and it was a big bus. Yeah. But it was a great way for me to sort of get my feet wet and to realize that that's not what I wanted to do. And it was, one of probably the only way that I could have really gotten into it myself. Now, fast forward maybe 2 years after that, and I decided that I didn't want to work with a big company like that, because I think I did one other trip to Egypt with them. But what I did for that was I said, you know what, I'm going to put together my own trip, soup to nuts. And so with my assistant at the time, Rebecca, it was going to be a trip to Spain, which I had been, I told you, when I was 15. So I love Spain. I speak the language. I knew where I wanted to bring this group. So I had a really good idea for the base of the trip, but we had to contact at least 4 different hotels for Madrid, Segovia, Toledo, Barcelona, 4 different guides, different restaurants, experiences, transportation, train, local buses. I figured it was like 36 different vendors that, number one, we had to tell our story to and who we were and why they should work with us. It ended up, in a nutshell, it was a nightmare.
Sure.
So I said, forget it. That's not what I'm going to do anymore. I'm going to work with a local tour operator who knows everything in that destination, knows all the hotels, guides, transportation, etc. And now that's what I do. I work in conjunction with them. I tell them exactly what I'm looking for, what I'm not looking for, which is just as important. We don't really want to do museums and things like that. People can do that in their free time, because typically on my trips, half-day scheduled, half-day free time. And so it allows people to do things that aren't on the itinerary. But that was probably the best decision I ever made with regards to my business.
Of getting away from the big tour experimenting by doing it, all of it yourself, and figuring out that there was just way too much front end work, and there's probably too many moving variables for something to happen.
Absolutely.
And then locking in with a tour guide. Now they have a local person, local tour guide, because now they have a vested interest, because it's a win-win. Right? Everybody's winning with that scenario. So one of the things, as I'm listening to you, as you first talked about the restaurant stuff, and being involved with the restaurant business, and maybe these go back to lessons that you experienced either directly or vicariously through your parents. So if that was the case, definitely throw that in there. But that, like, some of the things that sounds like you've changed in the business standpoint, or had to do with what does Ralph want to do? What when you talk about the experience that you wanted to have for the individuals that are going to go, I get this feeling that it's what you would want on an experience. It seems to be kind of that grounding piece, regardless if it's the restaurant, even if it's a small thing, like when you said switching from being a restaurant owner to something else, that I want to take a shower before I go to work versus after I go to work. I mean, that seems like a small thing unless you work in the restaurant business, and then you'll know exactly what that means. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, or am I on to some?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I like to think I'm a fairly regular guy, and I've got fairly standard tastes, but and so I think that I think the people that come on my trips are similar to me, and they like my style of travel, the types of trips that I do. They like the half-day scheduled, half-day free time. Some people don't. Some people want 12 hours a day scheduled. They don't want to have to think of what they're going to do during their free time, and they should go on those big bus trips where everything is planned all the time. They probably will be disappointed with my kind of trip. But there's a whole group of people that are very comfortable. They want a really nice framework for a trip. Everything's figured out from the time you get to the airport in the location to when you leave. We get you to the airport. We tell you where to be when with the flights, and you set up your own flights. But the idea is that I think that the people that follow me like to do what I like to do. They have very similar tastes and interests. And so it works out great because I feel like I'm traveling with friends more than clients.
Sure.
And I can't tell you how many great friends I've developed just out of people, strangers at first, coming onto my trips, and then you're with them for 10, 12, even 14 days, and because they're so similar, we all just have a blast, and it's like traveling with friends. So really makes my job easy.
Sure.
Yeah.
So okay. So then, as you and I listen to business owners, entrepreneurs, business leaders. How do we know when to stick? Because there is an aspect of endurance and stamina to stick with something, to have the discipline to stick with something and push through the difficult times. And then how do we get that sense of knowing it's time to transform and adapt? You talked about your dad wanting to get into the restaurant business. What did he do before that?
I think at that time he was an electrician / air conditioning guy.
So he had this idea of what this must be like to be a restaurant owner, and they were looking at this new industry of what McDonald's was doing with franchising, and so they adapted it to another industry. I mean, not another industry, but another type of restaurant.
Right.
And so there must be this element of trusting your gut, trusting your own intuition, your own feeling. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes people ask me, how do you choose the locations that you go to, the different countries and places that you go? And I say, well, first and foremost, I have to be interested in the place. Because if I'm going to try to sell this trip, I need to be enthusiastic about it, and it's hard for me to sell something that I don't believe in or am not enthusiastic about. So that's how I come up with that. And then it's about doing the things that I enjoy doing on the trips, but also keeping in mind that my clientele are anywhere from 40s to 70s, and physically, can they handle certain things? And everything's optional, of course. So people sometimes will bow out of hikes or different things that are a little bit more physical. But when I shifted, that's what I want. I'm like, why am I doing this thing that is really difficult, and I'm really not enjoying? Life's too short. It's that old saying, and so I'm like, I want to figure out how to create this travel business and make a living from photography and travel, which again I thought was like being a rock star, but with digital photography, social media, the internet, all these different things sort of came together and made it so that virtually anyone can start a tour company or start a company. And so I actually teach people how to organize and lead their own tours. And that, I just say have some sort of a common thread or a niche. And mine was photography, and now with the new Alla Campagna experiences is about food and culture and interest in the Mediterranean, because they're all based around the Mediterranean. But it might be yoga or wellness or music, whatever the common thread is.
Sure.
Build a trip around that. And so that's kind of what I did. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, because I think that is an element, is that the best product or service that we're going to be able to bring to someone else is something that works for us. It's not only do we have to believe in it, as you said, be enthusiastic about it, but it has to enhance our life as well. And I know for me, a big part of people ask, so how'd you get into the podcast? Why'd you start doing a podcast? And part of it is that I'd been listening to podcasts for the longest time, and that was how I was getting content, and that's how I was learning new information. And so started the idea that back in 2001, when I first opened up KP, I was doing these monthly reflections on just observations. It was just a 2-paragraph newsletter, and because I enjoy hearing people's stories, and that was what I used to give away monthly. It made sense, and so it's just been an extension. I think that element of being able to find things that are just extension of who you are, and if you can figure out from a business standpoint how to monetize that, that's even, that's a plus, right? And, as I've gotten to know you over the years, I remember a story that I had from someone a long time ago, that a couple came back to me, and that they were going to get their captain's license, and they were going to buy a boat, and they were going to give tours in the Caribbean, and that's what they were going to do. And as they were down there doing some research on that, they were vacationing at the time, doing some research on it, the wife asked one of the guys, who that's what he did for a living, asked him, well, what do you do for retirement? She had a typical, stereotypical job of the 401k and the pension, all that type of stuff. So she asked him about, well, what do you do for retirement? What do you do for benefits? What do you do for all these things? Normal questions that people would ask. And as she told me the story, she kind of stood like he stood on the dock with the boat in the background, probably the sun setting, and goes, well, where do you think I am? And he was probably in his early 40s, and he was doing what he would do if he was retired. He just happened to be doing it in his 30s and 40s. So that was their selling point, for them to create the life that they wanted now, instead of waiting to some later date. And I think in a lot of ways, when we've met and I've listened to you talk about what you do, that's very, very much the same thing, is that you're living the life you'd be living if you were retired. You just happen to have created into a business. Now, I know that it's still work, and because anytime you do that and you turn something into a business or a job, then there is going to be the element to work, because now it isn't just at leisure. There's time limits and constraints and different things like that. But being able to listen to that intuition and knowing when to adapt the business or shift it because something's shifting within you. So before we go and talk about your new adventure, I want to do a couple more questions. I know that one of the places that you had gone to numerous tours, was Cuba, and that of probably many countries that you've been to over the 11 years has changed tremendously. So tell us a little bit about how Cuba's changed and how the tours have changed since you've been going. How many tours have you? How many times have you brought people to Cuba?
18 times.
18 times, yeah. over the 11 years.
Yep. I guess it's been about 9 years that I've been going there.
Okay.
Yeah, since 2010. And so I used to do 4 tours a year to Cuba. These are fully licensed people-to-people programs. Some people can sneak in through the back door, but of course I would never do that with a group. But there were. Back 10 years ago, there was really just 1 or 2 really nice hotels in Havana, and now there's more, but there's so much more demand. I don't even know what the numbers are of how much tourism has grown. I think at the time, the whole world's been going to Cuba forever. It's just the Americans that hadn't been since this embargo. But to the Canadians, it's their Florida. They just pop down there, just fly right over the U.S. and go right to Cuba. But now there's better hotels, but the prices are not inexpensive. You would think that Cuba would be very inexpensive, but it's really not that inexpensive. But some of the hotels that we were staying at, because we couldn't get into these big hotels because National Geographic and all these huge tour companies, could pay huge deposits to block out rooms years in advance, and I couldn't compete with that. So we would stay at these more secondary hotels, and they were tired, and they were not great, and so I was getting a fair amount of complaints from clients. They loved the trip, but the hotel was difficult. The hotels we were staying at now, and they've had this for a while, but these casas particulares, which are rooms in people's homes or apartments, so it's almost like Airbnb, and Airbnb is actually down there now. They're organizing rooms, but now we found an incredible casa particular, which is these actually different floors with 3 rooms with their own bathrooms. They're apartments. Okay. And they're in a great location, and it's really the only reason I'm still going back, because I was so disappointed with the hotels and I couldn't get into the really nice ones. So, but Cuba's changed a lot, but not all for the worse. Even with a lot of tourism, it's much more crowded, but I think it's better for the people because there's a lot more hard currency going down there, and but I've made so many great friends over those 18 trips. I love going back. I love introducing my people to those people, my clients to those people that I've known for many, many years. And, nothing better than walking into a bar and there's a whole band there that I know, and they stop playing and they all hug me. And, I think my clients, they enjoy that. And then they become best friends with them. And it's there's nothing like it. The Cuban people are absolutely fantastic.
So you are a rock star, just like you said you wanted to be.
I've been up there a few times on stage with them. Yeah,
there you go.
Because they'd love to do that. Yeah,
sure. So when you think of, and obviously the stories, and maybe this will be, when I ask this question, it's probably an unfair question. So feel free to state that. But if there was a place that you went to into it, you were intrigued by it, but then it totally surprised you because it was even better than you thought. If anything stands out in your mind, and I know that could probably be 100 different choices, but if there's one particular story that pops in your mind of a place that you thought, oh, this will be cool, but then when you got there, it was even better than you thought.
Well, going back to Cuba, one of I think the first trip I took down there, a client who's again become a very good friend of mine, has been on several of my trips. He had always been going to Cambodia, and he had been going for about 10 years. Every year he would go, and he kept saying, you got to go to Cambodia, we got to do it. So we're sitting in Cuba with a third friend of ours, and we're just having a beer, and he says, what's our next trip going to be? We just had such a great time. And he says, let's go to Cambodia. I said, okay, let's do it, because he's been trying to get me to go there forever. So I said, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I said, but I want like 3 or 4 days where I can just do nothing. I want to just sit on the beach because I need that. And he's like, yeah, fine. So went to Cambodia, absolutely loved it. It's now one of my top 3 favorite countries that I've been to. And those other 2 keep rotating, but
sure.
It's just fantastic. I also do Vietnam, which is right next door, but I always say Cambodia is like Vietnam maybe 15 years ago. But the food is phenomenal. The people are super. The things that you see and the photographs you could take, the landscapes, it's just outstanding.
Interesting. Okay. And I think for individuals who have not traveled, I think there's this association with that area of the world, Cambodia and Vietnam, with the horrors of the Vietnam War. And so I don't think the general person actually thinks about visiting there, and I think it's different than if people talk about going to New Zealand or going to Australia or somewhere like that, or even necessarily the Philippines. But so that's an interesting that you would definitely say would be one of the top places to.
Yeah, don't forget that Cambodia had its own atrocities in the middle 70s with the Khmer Rouge, and so we make that a part of the trip. We go to Tuol Sleng, to S21, where it was a former grade school that they turned into a prison, and we see where these things actually happen. There's a man there till this day, if he's still alive. He's fairly young. He's probably only 55 or so today. That grew up during that, and he's written a book, and he's there, and he'll talk to you about what actually happened back then. We go to other to the killing fields, which you've probably heard of, and so that's a part of the story. So you could go there and not see those things, but you're not seeing the complete story, because it's about the good and the bad, right? And it's tough. It's really tough to see those things, but I think my clients are happy that we showed it to them and that they got a feel for that.
Well, because like you said, it's part of the story, so then it needs to be part of the experience. There's a depth to it, and then it gives I would think even a greater appreciation for the people then that they meet. Right?
Yeah, because when you meet these people and you realize what they lived through and how wonderful they are today, you're like, how could they be like that? And it's just incredible resilience. Yeah. But the fact is too that probably 80% of the country wasn't even alive then. That's a very young country, so they didn't have to live through that. But the older folks absolutely did.
Sure.
It's very tough.
Yeah. So going back to, and I know you've over the time have done a lot of different things, a lot of different opportunities. You were saying earlier that you used to have your own podcast, and I know that you've looked into and done some work on creating a documentary. I think you introduced to me the first time I've heard of a sizzle reel. I don't think I had ever heard of that before. And so there's been a lot of different things. Now this new project that you have, tell us a little bit about that and where'd that come from, about creating the experience that it's less about photography and more about being in one location. So tell us a little bit, Knight, because that's fairly new. It's less than 2 years old, right?
Yeah, really just about a year old. I've been thinking about it for a couple of years, but some of my clients were telling me that they wanted to come on my trips, but when you go to Cambodia or India, Bhutan, Nepal, these places that are literally halfway around the world, you're probably not going to go there for a week. You want to go there and maximize the effort that it took you to get there. So they were asking me for shorter trips, less moving around, less about photography, which again, my trips were never photo tours, and a photo workshop to me is 12 hours a day, all photography all the time. And there's a lot of people that enjoy those kinds of trips. And there's companies that put those together. And it's just not my kind of trip. And so they were asking for a little bit less photography. I want to put the camera down. So I love the Mediterranean, Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Sicily, and so it's probably my favorite part of the world region. And it's again, my people can drink the water. They don't have to worry about street food and things like that. It's very Western. So I decided to create this series of trips called A la Campagna Experiences, and it's a bit of an homage to my mother, whose last name is Campagna, or her maiden name is Campagna, which means countryside in Italian. So it means to the countryside. And the idea is to base ourselves in one, maybe two locations over the course of 7 to 10 days. But the location is going to be something like a privately owned castle or a wine estate, an agriturismo, some really impressive property where the property itself is destination. You may not want to leave. So the first trip's going to be to France's magical Dordogne. That's the name of it, and it's the Dordogne region, southwestern France. We're staying at a private castle. This man's owned it for over 30 years. But we're going to do day trips from there. Of course, we're not just going to sit at the castle for 7 days, but we're about a half-day scheduled, half-day free time, and we're going to do little day trips to nearby villages, markets, things like that. Free time for people to hang out. It's got a pool, it's got a game room, it's got wine tasting, all kinds of stuff. This is 18 rooms. It's got 18 rooms, each with their own bathroom, but it's 270 acres. And he said when he bought it, it had a table and 2 chairs in it.
Oh wow!
And can you imagine what it takes to furnish
a castle? No,
a castle, an 18-bedroom castle.
Yeah.
Well, now it is chock full of antiques and tapestries, stained glass. He's got the largest private tile collection in the world. Oriental rugs. Every room is incredible.
So when you say castle, I have my head goes back to King Arthur days and that piece, and then so are we talking big rooms? I mean, so describe the inside.
It's an 11th century castle.
Okay.
So it's a huge property, and I think it's grown over the years, but the main section of it is your typical you look in the dictionary under castle and there's a picture of this place.
Sure. Okay.
It's really incredible. The rooms aren't necessarily huge, but they're good size, and he's got they're mostly decorated with all the period sort of furniture and things like that, and just super interesting. The plumbing is I mean, obviously it works, but some of the stairs creak, and you can imagine what it takes to maintain a castle. I even asked them if it would be possible to bring a group there in March, because I had a particular group that was looking to do something in March, and I said, well, maybe we could go to this castle. And so I asked the owner, I said, hey, Miles, would it be possible? He says, do you have any idea what it takes to heat a castle in March? I said, yeah, okay, you're probably right. We'll find somewhere else.
And you said this is in Spain or in France?
This is southwestern France, the
southwestern
Dordogne region of France.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah, so it's incredible though, and we're going to do little day trips to nearby towns, the villages, Bordeaux and Brantôme and Ribérac, and just go to market days and have some meals at Michelin-starred restaurants and things like that.
Gotcha.
Of course, we're going to have our cameras with us. I mean, who doesn't?
Yeah.
But it's not going to be photo walks and image reviews and instruction and those kinds of things that people will find on my photo enrichment adventures trips.
Sure, gotcha.
Which I'm still doing.
Sure.
But just less of.
Sure. A little bit more of a balancing.
Yeah.
With the two. Gotcha.
Exactly.
So we've talked about a lot of the upsides of doing this, but like anything that gets turned into a business, there's downsides. And so of those downsides, or of those things that you've had to persist through or develop that level of resiliency to persevere through, what would you say would be some of the downsides? Because it isn't a vacation, right? I mean, for you it isn't. I mean, it's work, so what would you say are a couple of the downsides? Because I think it's important. I want people who are listening to know that, this is a life that you can have. I mean, maybe it won't be exactly what you're doing with this, but it's about planting seeds about what they could do. But it's not only should we talk about the possibility to create those dreams of that, but then also be aware of the things that you're going to learn along the way. But almost all those things are as a result of some type of difficulty or stress or hardship. So what would you say have been some of the difficult things, or the hardship may be too strong of a word, but difficult things that you've learned?
Yeah, well, the biggest negative is try having any sort of a relationship when you're on the road 9 months out of the year internationally in different places. It's virtually impossible. I've never been married. I don't have children. It's probably the only way that I could possibly do this is because I don't have a family, because not many women would put up with their spouse being gone for 9 months out of the year. But that's one of the hardest things, is just not being able to have a stable relationship. It'd be great if I could find someone that could travel with me and be a part of the business and help me. But it's probably needle in a haystack.
Sure.
The other thing is just I love being in these places, but it's getting there and back. It's the travel part. It's the 14-hour flights and airports and lines and traffic and all those things. People tend to gripe about those things when they do them once a year for their their 2-week vacation that they take. But imagine being on 50 airplanes a year and God knows how many airports and dozens and dozens of hotels and Airbnbs. Last year I got a notification from Airbnb and said, we'd just like to thank you for staying in for 69 nights in Airbnbs in 9 different cities around the world. And so that was just 69 nights in Airbnbs. That didn't even count the probably 200 nights in hotels that I spent as well.
Sure.
Packing and unpacking every 2-3 nights, maybe sometimes one. So that part of it gets old.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest with you, there's something that I just got back from San Diego, I told you, and there's something about just sitting on an airplane that makes me super creative. I get some of my best ideas just sitting on airplanes and kind of just working, and just for some reason it's like being in the shower, ideas come to me, and so that part of it I don't mind, but it's the waiting at the airports, the lines. Once I'm on that plane, I'm usually okay.
Sure. Well, I imagine, like you said earlier, it's probably a way for you to go into that, or you can choose to go into that meditative state and go into that, because the distractions can be less, because there's a limited amount of what you can do. As you said, one of the downsides of being a business owner, an entrepreneur, creative, is that the work's never fully completed, and there's not a day when you're going to go, all right, all the boxes are checked. If that's the case, then you probably didn't look around the corner where there's more boxes to look into. But there are that element, maybe when you're there, you know what you can do, and you can't do any more than that. Yeah. And so maybe that opens up that opportunity to be creative.
Yep.
So Ralph, well, let me ask you, besides the piece of doing your new the new service that you're offering with that new experience, what other things you have anything coming up in 2020? Any new things that you're doing or providing for your clients?
Yeah, I mean, the first quarter of the year, I'm almost always speaking at the travel shows here in the U.S. So these are the travel and adventure shows, series of shows. Also at the New York Times Travel Show, so that's coming up. But I'm also working on a YouTube channel that I'm pretty excited about, building a little sort of studio in my mom's basement.
Okay.
She's got a great little room down there that wasn't being used at all, and so I'm converting it into a YouTube studio. So I'm excited about creating a channel that will talk to mostly baby boomers, which are pretty much my target market right now. So roughly 40s to 70s, even into the 80s year-old people that are interested in travel and basic photography tips. Okay. And we're all photographers. I mean, whether it's just a smartphone or a high-end DSLR, but the vast majority of us, if not 100% of us these days, have a camera in our pocket, and I'm shooting a lot more with just my iPhone. Mm-hmm. So it'll be basic camera tips, photography tips, but also travel tips. I love making mistakes or learning things, or getting ripped off, and then helping other people not to have that happen to them. Mm-hmm. So that's what I am looking forward to doing, is teach. Again, it allows me to teach,
right.
And so I'm looking forward to getting that channel going. It'll be partly about interviews with other travel and photography experts, part of maybe some product and service reviews. It'll be me in the field on these trips or in these places doing some episodes, but also sitting in the studio as well. So I'm really excited about that, because what I do is so visual. Yeah. I wanted to do a podcast, and there may be a video podcast that comes out of it, but what I do is so visual. The places I am are so stunning that it only makes sense to have video be a big part of it, and YouTube just makes so much sense.
Sure. It's kind of like what you said earlier when we were talking about capturing those elements, that what already interest you, that you utilize, and then how do you utilize that platform, how do you utilize that experience, and then bring that to other people. And similar to you spending a lot of time on YouTube learning how to do something new, now you're going to use that platform to be able to share some of your experiences. And I think of an individual, and I'm trying to remember, I'm drawing a blank right now. I think his name was Guy. I'm not 100% positive, but he was an individual who early on when the social media platforms first broke through. His dad was in the liquor business in New York City, and he started doing a YouTube channel on
Gary Vaynerchuk.
Yes, yeah, that's what Gary.
Gary V.
Yeah, and it was the wine tasting, and all he did was taste wine and give his opinion or his thoughts about the wine, and it was so useful for people because it was a way of especially at that time period when wine first became super popular. He was giving tips about his experience with drinking wine, and I think those types of things are so important, and people utilizing that for the ones that want to capture those things.
Yeah, for sure. And if I could just briefly say that I've got something huge coming up that perhaps you'll have me on another time.
Okay.
I can't talk about it right now because I don't want to jinx it or let the cat out of the bag. We've talked about it before, but not publicly.
Okay.
So I'm really excited about that, and that'll be a part of this YouTube channel as well.
And that's possibly in 20 as well?
Hopefully this will happen in early 2020, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Well, Ralph, as we wrap up today, and for anybody who may be listening, either from a business standpoint or want to experience one of your trips, what would, or someone who wants to create their own, taking their dream and bring it into a possibility, what would you want to share with somebody as we part today?
Where people can find me?
Definitely that. But before that, we're individuals who want to experience more than just what they're used to, or from a business standpoint of creating, living their dream of doing something. What would you share with them?
One of the big lessons that I learned when I went from that second restaurant back in 2004 and I had to make that decision, it was very, very difficult starting this business from scratch, especially at that time, which was essentially before social media. Mm-hmm. We're talking 2006-07, before things really started happening with that, which makes it easier now. But it's just to be persistent. Mm-hmm. I burned all the bridges. I found that over my life I tried many, many things, but I always had a fallback. Mm-hmm. And they tell you, always have a fallback. Well, I think sometimes that can go against you because it makes you not push as hard after that thing that you really want because you always got a fallback.
Yeah.
So I burned the bridges and I had to make this thing work.
Sure.
And so that would be my biggest takeaway.
Okay. And knowing you as long as I've known you, I think that, not that doesn't come with its own stress, but I do think that is, I think that's 100% key because I've seen you experience that, and you have to make it work and figure it out, and that's also where that listening to that intuition and that creativity comes in, and where that next thing for you to do comes from it. Mm-hmm. So if people want to get a hold of you to learn more about what you're doing, or maybe even want to book a trip, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Sure. So my main websites are photoenrichment.com, and my new Alla Campagna experiences are at allacampagna.com. And I'll just spell that quickly. Hopefully you'll put maybe a link in the show notes. ALLACAMPAGNA.com. And that's where people can find me. Also look for me on Facebook. I've got, at Ralph Velasco on all the social media networks, at Photo Enrichment, and at Alla Campagna as well. So trying to get more active on social media, so hopefully people can follow along, especially on Instagram and Facebook. For those kinds of things.
All right. Yeah. Well, Ralph, thanks for being here. And as always, when we get together, I always love to hear about your trips and where you've been and what you're going to go and do next. So,
I appreciate you having me on, Kevin.
So, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
So thank you very much for being with us today. And as we listen to Ralph tell his story about how he wanted to live a life and live a life that he wanted versus being fit into a box, I think some of those lessons that he talked about, but most importantly, this idea of persistence, that and being able to burn those boats and burn those bridges so that it's not easy to go back to. There's something to be said about that, about not playing with a safety net. So thank you very much. I appreciate you being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.